Top 5 Prison Escapes That Shocked the World. The siren cut through the night like a blade. Searchlights swept across the barbed wire, tearing through the darkness of Auschwitz as guards shouted orders in German. Boots slammed against gravel. Dogs barked, straining at their leashes. Somewhere inside the camp, the count was wrong. 2 prisoners were missing. At Auschwitz, that didn't mean an escape. It meant punishment. Collective punishment. Barracks were torn apart. Prisoners were dragged from bunks and forced to stand in freezing air, motionless, for hours. Every missing man meant suffering multiplied across thousands. But this time was different. Because Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler were already gone. Days earlier, they had disappeared into the perimeter of the camp itself, hiding where no one thought to look. Not running. Not panicking. Waiting. Every second they stayed hidden was a gamble with death. Auschwitz was designed to erase people. Its fences, watchtowers, and routines were built to make escape unthinkable. Few tried. Fewer survived. No one left with proof. Vrba and Wetzler intended to change that. Both men had spent months studying the machinery of the camp. They watched transports arrive. They counted people who never left. They memorized schedules, guard rotations, and the language of bureaucracy that masked mass murder as logistics. They understood something terrifying: the world outside did not know. And if it did know, it did not fully believe. The Nazis relied on that disbelief. The plan was reckless by necessity. There were no tunnels. No weapons. Only patience and timing. With help from other prisoners, they hid in a hollowed-out space near the camp's boundary, concealed with planks and earth. They masked their scent using tobacco soaked in gasoline, anything to confuse the dogs. For 3 days they did not move. Above them, the camp continued. Roll calls. Whistles. Orders. Death operating on schedule. Guards searched and failed to find them, assuming the missing men were already dead. That assumption saved their lives. On the 4th night, when the search was called off, Vrba and Wetzler crawled out. They didn't sprint. They walked, calmly, into the surrounding countryside of Nazi-occupied Poland, dressed in stolen clothing, carrying nothing but what they had memorized. What they carried mattered more than their lives. They moved at night, hiding by day, navigating forests and villages where being discovered meant execution. Every encounter was a risk. A question asked the wrong way. A glance held too long. Papers they did not have. They crossed borders by instinct and luck, driven by one objective: get the truth out. Weeks later, exhausted and emaciated, they reached Slovakia. Safe, for the moment. There, they began to write. What followed was one of the most detailed eyewitness accounts ever produced during the Holocaust. Page after page. Numbers. Diagrams. Schedules. Gas chambers. Crematoria. Transport capacities. The industrial scale of murder laid out with chilling precision. It wasn't a plea. It was evidence. The report described Auschwitz not as rumor or exaggeration, but as a system. A process refined for efficiency. It named dates. It explained how selections worked. Who lived temporarily. Who was sent directly to die. It shattered the illusion that no one could know for sure. The document would later become known as the Vrba-Wetzler Report. And once it existed, the danger multiplied. Because knowledge is a threat. The report had to be smuggled, copied, translated, passed through resistance networks and diplomats. Each transfer risked exposure. Each delay meant more trains arriving, more people disappearing behind the gates. Vrba and Wetzler had escaped. The world's response was slow. Disbelief lingered. Political caution dulled urgency. But the report reached the right eyes. Pressure mounted. Debates erupted. For the first time, the machinery of Auschwitz was documented from the inside by men who had walked out alive. The Nazis tried to suppress it, to discredit it, to drown it in denial. They couldn't. But even as the report spread, a darker truth emerged, one that would haunt historians for decades. Some leaders had already heard fragments of this story before. They had hesitated. And as Vrba and Wetzler waited, hidden now in plain sight beyond the camp's reach, one question loomed over everything they had risked. Had they escaped in time? Because while the world argued over the truth, the trains kept running. And when investigators later compared dates, routes, and decisions, they realized something devastating. The report arrived just days before one of the largest deportations in history. And whether it would change anything, whether it could stop what was coming, was still uncertain. Because when the truth finally broke free from Auschwitz, it collided with a world that wasn't ready to act. The report was finished, but the danger was just beginning. Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler sat in a cramped room in Slovakia, staring at the pages they had forced into existence. Their hands shook, not from fear anymore, but from exhaustion. Every detail had been dragged from memory and set down with care. They knew precision mattered. If even one number was wrong, the entire document could be dismissed as exaggeration. And dismissal was a death sentence for people they would never meet. The report did not move like a message. It moved like contraband, copied by hand, folded into coats, passed between resistance members who could not ask questions. Each person who touched it risked arrest, interrogation, disappearance. The Nazis understood something instinctively. Weapons could be fought, armies resisted, but truth was corrosive. It spread. Slowly at first. Diplomats received fragments. Jewish leaders received summaries. Allied representatives were shown copies that felt impossible to absorb. Auschwitz was not a prison camp. It was not a labor camp. It was a machine built to process human beings into absence. Some refused to believe it. Not because it was unbelievable, but because believing it demanded action. Vrba learned quickly that escape did not end captivity. It only changed its shape. He and Wetzler were now fugitives from disbelief. They answered questions again and again, repeating the same facts, correcting the same misunderstandings. How many per transport? How many per day? How the process worked? They spoke until their voices went flat. Meanwhile, the calendar moved forward. In Hungary, preparations were already underway. Trains were being scheduled. Bureaucrats were coordinating lists. The same system Vrba and Wetzler had described was about to scale up. Pressure mounted behind closed doors. Some leaders urged immediate action, warnings, public statements, disruptions of rail lines. Others hesitated, fearing retaliation, fearing panic, fearing the consequences of being wrong. The report forced a terrible calculation. How much proof is enough when time is the only resource you don't have? As copies spread, so did resistance. The report was translated into German and circulated quietly among officials who could read it without intermediaries. The language stripped away euphemism. It named what had been hidden behind words like resettlement. For the first time, the system was visible. That visibility changed conversations. Air raid priorities were debated. Diplomatic cables sharpened. Protests grew louder. The Nazis responded the only way they knew how, by accelerating, by denying, by tightening control. The truth had escaped Auschwitz, but Auschwitz was adapting. Vrba watched from a distance, knowing that survival had given him a burden heavier than imprisonment. He had lived. Others had not. That imbalance demanded purpose. He pressed on, meeting officials, writing more, clarifying details that felt unbearable to revisit. Every night he wondered the same thing. Was it enough? Historians would later argue over impact, over causality, over numbers. But inside that moment, none of it was abstract. Decisions made in offices rippled outward, intersecting with rail lines and schedules and names on lists. Some transports were delayed. Some plans were reconsidered. Others moved forward anyway. The report did not stop the Holocaust. Nothing could. But it cracked the silence that protected it. It replaced rumor with documentation. It removed the excuse of ignorance. And that mattered. For the Nazis, the escape had become an embarrassment they could not erase. Guards were punished. Procedures changed. Security tightened. The camp learned from the breach. That learning would cost lives in a different way. Vrba and Wetzler had escaped because the system assumed no one could. Now that assumption was gone. As the war dragged on, the report became evidence, used in trials, cited in investigations, referenced when the full scale of the crimes was finally confronted. The words written in that small room outlived the camp itself. But in 1944, none of that was guaranteed. All Vrba and Wetzler could do was wait and push and hope that somewhere, someone would decide that knowing demanded doing. The escape had succeeded. Whether it would save anyone remained uncertain. And as the machinery of the camp adjusted to ensure no one else ever left with the same knowledge, one reality became clear. This was not just a story about two men who escaped a prison. It was about a truth that broke through a system designed to make truth impossible. And in the next chapter, that truth would face its final test, when history would ask not how the escape happened, but what the world chose to do once it could no longer claim it didn't know. The silence was broken. Not all at once. Not loudly. But permanently. Once the Wetzler Report crossed enough desks, the language around Auschwitz changed. Rumors hardened into figures. Accounts became diagrams. The fog that had allowed denial to live comfortably began to thin. Officials who had once spoken in cautious abstractions now argued over routes, dates, and consequences. Knowing forced a choice. In the spring and summer of 1944, as the deportations from Hungary loomed, the report pressed against decision-makers like a deadline. Warnings were issued. Appeals were made. Some rail movements were questioned. Some plans slowed. Pressure mounted through diplomatic channels that had previously treated the issue as distant or uncertain. It was not enough to stop everything. But it was enough to stop pretending. The Nazis responded with urgency of their own. Security tightened. Procedures were revised. The camp adjusted, an admission in itself. They could no longer rely on invisibility. They could only rely on speed. For Rudolf Vrba, the waiting was the hardest part. Escape had demanded nerve, survival demanded endurance. He watched the world react in fragments, partial measures, delayed responses, debates that felt unbearable when measured against the schedules he had memorized. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, how bureaucracy absorbs shock and converts it into delay. Yet delay is not nothing. Trains were postponed. International attention sharpened. The report circulated further, translated and reprinted, carried into places the camp had never anticipated. When the war ended and the full scope of the crimes was laid bare, the document stood ready, not as hindsight, but as contemporaneous proof. It changed how history would be written. At trials, when defendants claimed ignorance or exaggeration, the report answered. When skeptics argued that the truth had been unknowable, the dates and details contradicted them. It became one of the foundations upon which accountability rested, not because it captured everything, but because it captured enough. The escape had done what bullets could not. It had documented a crime while it was still happening. That distinction matters. It means the world was not discovering a tragedy after the fact. It was being warned in real time. The question history continues to ask is not whether the warning existed, but how it was weighed. For Alfred Wetzler, who had shared the hiding place and the walk into the countryside, the knowledge was the same burden. They had survived by chance and precision. They had spoken because silence was complicity. The cost of that choice would follow them: scrutiny, doubt, the ache of what could not be undone. But it would also follow the world. Auschwitz did not end because of one report. No document could carry that weight alone. What the report did was remove a shield, the shield of uncertainty. After it, denial had to work harder. Euphemism had to stretch thinner. Excuses had to look the facts in the eye. In the years that followed, the camp became a symbol and the report a measure. Scholars argued over its immediate impact, counting trains and dates, tracing causality through tangled decisions. Those debates continue. They should. What cannot be debated is this: two men escaped a place designed to erase witnesses, and they carried out with them a record the system could not destroy. That is why this escape shocks the world. Not because it defied walls and wire, many have done that, but because it defied the logic of secrecy. It proved that even in the most controlled environments, truth can move. Slowly, dangerously, but decisively. When people ask whether it mattered, the answer is uncomfortable and honest. It mattered unevenly. It mattered late for many. It mattered enough for history to change its posture, from speculation to evidence. And evidence endures. Today, when the story is told, it is tempting to frame it as a triumph. It was not. It was a breach of silence, of disbelief, of the lie that nothing could be known. The cost was incalculable. The courage was precise. Vrba and Wetzler did not escape to be free. They escaped to be heard. That choice reframes everything. It turns a prison break into an act of documentation. It turns survival into testimony. It turns 2 missing names on a roll call into a record that outlived the camp. If this story unsettles you, it should. Not because of how rare such escapes are, but because of how often truth depends on them. The most dangerous prisons are not always made of stone and wire. Sometimes they are made of doubt, distance, and delay. And if this escape changed history, it did so by asking a question that still echoes, quietly, insistently. What do we do when we can no longer say we didn't know? Before this story escapes the silence it was buried under, hit subscribe, leave a like, and comment below.